Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I posed the question, should we avoid these wide receivers? I'm referring to DK Metcalf, DeAndre Hopkins, Adam Thielen, Robert Woods, and Julio Jones. Now, in their past, all 5 of these wide receivers have found fantasy football success. In fact, all of them have been wide receiver ones in seasons past. But unfortunately, there's a lot of questions revolving these players. For some, it's a question of whether or not their quarterbacks are good enough. For some, it's injury related. And for others, it's a question of whether or not a 6-game suspension justifies their current value as to where they're coming off of draft boards. Over the course of this video, I plan on addressing all of those questions, but of course adding statistics on top of it in order to justify my reasonings as to why you should be targeting or avoiding these players going into your 2022 fantasy football drafts. Now, speaking of drafts, for those of you who haven't checked it out already, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who are trying to gain an edge on your league mates and get draft experience under your belt, Underdog Fantasy is the best way to do it this offseason. Again, when you travel over to Underdog Fantasy from the link down in the description, and use promo code Andrew today. When you make a first deposit, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of that first deposit, but that's not all. Besides the deposit match and the drafts that you will be participating in, I will personally send you an email with my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half and full PPR scoring format. Again, those rankings are by tiered at the quarterback, wide receiver, running back, tight end, kicker, and defensive positions, along with my top 200 flex rankings in order to help you get prepared for your 2022 fantasy football drafts. But I'm not just only going to send you those rankings once. Over the course of the entirety of August, I will be sending you weekly updates of those rankings to make sure that you're up to date, you're making the best decisions, and you're preparing your team for success in 2022. So that's the plan. If you want to go ahead, take advantage of that today, use promo code Andrew or the link down in the description. Thank you very much. All right, so before we begin, I know we just recently surpassed 58K subs. I want to, of course, thank you guys for supporting the channel and getting us to this point where we're ever so close to getting to that 60K goal. So if you have not yet already and you want daily fantasy football content sent in your direction, this channel is the way to do it. Click subscribe down below. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into today's content, beginning with DK Metcalf, wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks. This entire offseason has been a conversation as to whether or not DK Metcalf can perform without Russell Wilson under center. And that's exactly what we're going to address. Are the quarterbacks that are currently in Seattle able to help DK Metcalf return to his fantasy excellence? Over the course of the last 2 years, DK Metcalf has been a top 12 fantasy wide receiver in back-to-back seasons. He's also averaged 13.06 fantasy points per game. Now, when we talk about total stats that DK Metcalf has put up in the first 3 years of his NFL career, we're talking about a category where he's comparing to Jerry Rice, Randy Moss, AJ Green, and Odell Beckham Jr., all wide receivers that in the first 3 years of their careers put up over 3,100 receiving yards and over 29 receiving touchdowns. Again, that's incredible company, and we know the kind of talent that DK Metcalf is because just a couple days ago, they inked him for a giant contract extension that pretty much keeps him in Seattle for the near future. Now, like I'm sure we've all experienced in seasons past, DK Metcalf is a great fantasy contributor. Anytime he's been given 6 or more targets in a game, he's averaging nearly 14 fantasy points per game like it says on screen. And over the course of the last 2 years, any game that he's had 4 or more receptions, he's averaging over 15 fantasy points per game. But we all know this. DK Metcalf is a stud. Yet, he's gone from being a top 12 wide receiver over the course of the last 2 seasons to currently being drafted near wide receiver 24, 21-ish. When you're in the 20s and we're talking about an elite level talent like this, the question is, why is he falling down the board on draft day? Well, obviously, it's the impact of not having Russell Wilson under center. Now, we've mentioned this in regards to Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy this offseason, based on the fact that they will, of course, be complemented by the success and the skill that Russell Wilson brings to Denver. But the main thing that DK Metcalf is going to be missing is the Russell Wilson deep ball effect. Russell Wilson has been the most impactful deep passing quarterbacks in terms of targets 20 or more yards down the field in the National Football League over the course of the last 3 years. Since 2019, Russell Wilson has led the quarterback position in terms of passing targets over 20 yards down the field. He's second in terms of yardage, second in terms of completions, and third in attempts of that matter. He has obviously helped DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett get to where they've been in securing their contracts. But the question is, can DK Metcalf live without those stats? Over the course of the last 3 years, he's had 30 receptions, 1,130 yards and 11 receiving touchdowns, all contributed from those deep passing targets. And though the absence of Russell Wilson is certainly going to impact the overall upside of DK Metcalf, we still have to take into account last season amongst all wide receivers, he was number 6 in terms of yards after contact, and he was number 9 in terms of broken tackles after the catch. Listen, this is a big-bodied wide receiver. If you can get him the ball in space, he will make yardage up. It doesn't always have to be a 50-yard bomb over the top of an opposing defense. And though those fantasy points are definitely welcomed, we'll take those, I really do think that the quarterback options that the Seattle Seahawks present aren't as bad as we think. So, when we looked at Geno Smith's stats last season, when Russell Wilson went down with the mallet finger, Geno Smith was actually a serviceable quarterback. 5 passing touchdowns, only 1 interception in the 4 games that he played with the Seattle Seahawks. From weeks 5 through 8 of the 2021 season with Geno Smith, DK Metcalf had great opportunity and great statistics overall. In fact, he was averaging 14.4 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. Now, if we take into account the fact that Geno Smith only played 13 quarters as the starting quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks last year, and you take all the stats that DK Metcalf accumulated throughout those 13 quarters and gone ahead and spread that over a full game basis, DK Metcalf, in fact, was averaging 17.72 fantasy points per game with Geno Smith last season. In my opinion, Geno Smith isn't really that bad of an option. Yes, there are going to be some games that Geno Smith puts the team in bad positions, but we don't expect this team to be good anyway. I'd guess that the Seattle Seahawks, in terms of expected win totals this year, is near the bottom of the National Football League, considering who is playing quarterback for them. So what does that mean? They're going to be in negative game scripts most likely, and they're going to be throwing the ball a lot in second halves to their primary wide receivers, DK Metcalf being one of them. Now, let's talk about the potential of Drew Lock coming in. If in fact Geno Smith isn't able to get the job done and help this team win games, eventually they're going to switch quarterbacks. Whether that's week 4, whether that's week 14, we don't know. Drew Lock is another quarterback that I'm not too worried about in regards to the potential of DK Metcalf in 2022, and I'll tell you why. Pete Carroll this offseason, when they traded away Russell Wilson and got back, of course, Drew Lock, Noah Fant, and a bunch of first-round picks, in that trade, after it had gone and taken place, Pete Carroll said if Drew Lock was a quarterback coming out of the 2022 NFL draft, at his current position, he would have been the first quarterback taken off the board. They are excited about the potential that he provides. And if he's able to sit back, watch, learn this offense from Geno Smith, then eventually take over the reins, maybe, just maybe, he can find success. And the reason why I believe success is possible, because the receiving options in Seattle are far better than what Drew Lock had over there in Denver. And I understand there may be a change in terms of scheme in the offensive line, and those could certainly pose threats in terms of his overall upside. But when I looked at Drew Lock's history throughout his National Football League career since 2019, if you look at the first 17 healthy starts that Drew Lock participated in, where he was the starting quarterback and he didn't leave early due to injury, Drew Lock had incredible numbers. Over the first 17 healthy starts of his career, 4,100 passing yards, 24 passing touchdowns, 253 rushing yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns. That's a total of 269 fantasy points. Yes, he was littered with interceptions through 16 of them in his first 17 healthy starts. But hey, the picks don't bother me. As long as this team is getting the ball back and throwing once again when they're in negative game scripts, seems like DK Metcalf may be in a very advantageous position going into the 2022 fantasy football season. While others may be avoiding DK Metcalf because of the uncertainty at the quarterback, I am taking this as an opportunity to have a discount at a player that is not only proven to be a wide receiver one in the past, but could very easily once again be that this season. Moving on, let's talk about DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver of the Arizona Cardinals. Obviously, we're all aware of what the situation is with DeAndre Hopkins. He is going to be suspended for the first 6 games of the season. But before we get into that, let me remind all of you, over the course of the last decade, DeAndre Hopkins has been one of the most consistent wide receivers in fantasy football. Prior to last year, where he, of course, dealt with huge injuries, he was a top 5 wide receiver for 4 consecutive seasons. Last year was the first season, in fact, that he missed games due to injury. DeAndre Hopkins, over his time with Houston, over his time in college, has always been a wide receiver that plays through injuries. So the fact that he missed as many games as he did last year kind of speaks to the severity of that injury, that it was to the point where he couldn't even play through it. Because we've seen him in seasons past, even though he's got a quad strain and he missed the entire week of practice, still goes out there on Sunday and takes on Jalen Ramsey. He's not afraid, and he's always willing to fight through the pain. But either way, we know the kind of stud he is. We know he's one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. He's a part of an offense that since 2019 and since Cliff Kingsbury joined this offense has been number 7 in terms of wide receiver targets. They continue to score a boatload of points. And over the course of the last 2 seasons with Kyler Murray under center, DeAndre Hopkins is averaging 14.3 fantasy points per game. Yet, there was a bit of a decline in 2021. And I feel it would be dishonest of me if I was to ignore the decline that we all saw. Not only did DeAndre Hopkins, in the time that he played last year, saw an average decline of 3.1 targets per game in comparison to 2020, but also 2.96 receptions per game decline, and it was about 20 to 30 receiving yards. The only thing that really saved DeAndre Hopkins last season was the fact that he was scoring touchdowns in bunches. He was able to, in 10 games, have 8 receiving touchdowns, which really mellowed out his overall fantasy point upside and saved many of us on the investment we made prior to his overall injury. Now, with all of that information presented, the question that I hear often is DeAndre Hopkins becoming the next Julio Jones? Now, the real meaning of that question is DeAndre Hopkins becoming an older wide receiver that is going to continue to face injuries and is going to continue to not be available for us in fantasy football? We all know that DeAndre Hopkins is going into the 9th year of his career. Julio Jones, in his 10th year of his career, when he was with the Atlanta Falcons, began to see that dip where injuries started to show up, and eventually he was starting to miss more and more games. He went to Tennessee, same thing happened, started missing more games. And the conversation began as to the age of a wide receiver going up and their production dipping and their availability because of injuries taking more tolls on them and their recovery processes not being as quick. Could we have seen the last of a great DeAndre Hopkins season? Is he become the new Julio Jones? And to that I say no. We'll be mentioning Julio Jones later on in today's episode, but I don't think DeAndre Hopkins is past his top years. I think he could very easily produce incredible numbers, and let's address that. Obviously, he's going to be missing the first 6 games of the 2022 season because of the suspension. So if in fact we see DeAndre Hopkins play 9 consecutive games between week 7 through 17 of the 2022 season, because they do have a bye week in there, you're basically investing a 6th round selection for 9 weeks. If we want to value DeAndre Hopkins in terms of a 1 through 250 wide receiver, where do we see him ranking at the end of the season? He'll be like wide receiver 40, something of that range. Because in 9 weeks, averaging 14 points per week, you're like at 130 points. That's typically wide receiver 40 and a half PPR. But from week 7 through 17, he'll probably be a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy football because of his overall contribution. Now, the question is, can you take the risk on draft day of selecting DeAndre Hopkins, who will only play 9 games for you, in the 6th round? Again, that is extremely, extremely expensive draft capital, especially considering we're in a situation where we don't know what DeAndre Hopkins is we're going to get. I mean, yes, Christian Kirk is gone. They bring in Marquise Hollywood-Brown. This offense could look different. His target counts could look a lot like it did last year. And if the touchdowns aren't there on a weekly basis, maybe DeAndre Hopkins isn't worth the investment. If I'm making a 6th round selection, like he's coming off of the boards in Underdog, and I understand Underdog is different because best ball, you're starting the best available player in any given week. But if DeAndre Hopkins is even a 7th or an 8th round pick, if I don't have my solidified top 3 wide receivers already by the time I select him, I'm pretty much not only clogging up a bench spot, but leaving myself up relatively vulnerable to, if my first 6 weeks of my season don't go well, maybe, just maybe, the last 9 weeks of DeAndre Hopkins' overall contribution isn't going to be enough to get me to my fantasy football playoffs, much less a championship. I think the commodity of having a 14-point wide receiver is incredible, especially if it's a guarantee, but it's not. And that's my biggest concern. Now, when he's coming off the board, the other wide receivers around him are like Drake London. Okay, Drake London's a rookie wide receiver on a team that is probably going to be losing a lot of games and has Marcus Mariota at their quarterback position. Is that a better investment? Can I get 9 solid weeks out of 17 from Drake London? Or should I just invest in DeAndre Hopkins and hope that in that 9-week stretch, he's healthy, he's active, and he's getting a boatload of targets? I'm kind of 50-50 on this. I think the conversation really depends on what your team looks like before you select DeAndre Hopkins. Have you addressed your wide receiver position? Do you have enough depth there? And can you afford to have this man on your bench for the first 6 weeks? These are all questions that you're going to have to ask yourself during a draft. But in many scenarios, I could see myself taking him. I could see myself drafting him and hoping for the best in the second half of that season. Because truly, if that kind of a top 10 wide receiver is inserted into my lineup, only 7 weeks in, we're talking about my team taking a huge step in comparison to having to start, Tyler Boyd as my wide receiver 3 for the first 6 weeks of the season, which you can certainly get away with. Hopefully this conversation has provided you some context as to what DeAndre Hopkins can provide in 2022 and some of the risks that go in, along with drafting him and investing in him at his current ADP. It's a bit risky, but hey, I'm up for it depending on my team, but the decision is yours. Moving on, let's talk about Adam Thielen, wide receiver of the Minnesota Vikings. Adam Thielen has been one of my favorite wide receivers over the course of the last 5-6 years in fantasy football, mainly because when he is on the field, he is an incredible fantasy point producer. In fact, over the course of his career, unless he has gotten injured and missed major time, he has always been a top 12 fantasy wide receiver. In fact, even top 10. Let's give you some context. In 2017, he was the number 10 overall wide receiver in fantasy. In 2018, he was the number 7. In 2019, he ended up missing a significant amount of time with an injury. But prior to his injury was the number 8 overall wide receiver from weeks 1 through 7 of the 2019 season. Again, he was averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game throughout that span prior to his injury. Then we go to 2020. He's the number 8 overall wide receiver in fantasy football by the end of the year. And last year was an incredible wide receiver prior to his injury. In fact, from weeks 1 through 12 was the number 7 overall wide receiver, averaging 14.57 fantasy points per game in 11 games. It is apparent that injuries have forced Adam Thielen to where he's currently being drafted. And I understand he's getting up there in age, and he has seen a lot of snaps over the last couple years. But if Adam Thielen is healthy, he is a top 12 fantasy wide receiver. I'm not telling you to draft him there. I'm just telling you what his potential upside is. Now, it's not only the talent of Adam Thielen, but it's also the opportunity that he has seen over the last couple seasons. Of course, we've seen Stephon Diggs and Justin Jefferson as the number 1 options of this offense over the course of the last 4 years all play well. In all of that time, Adam Thielen has still managed to, as the number 2 receiving option of this team, put together incredible numbers because of what Kirk Cousins has been able to do with this offense. In fact, when Adam Thielen went down with that injury late last season, from weeks 13 through 18, KJ Osborne was the number 16 overall wide receiver in fantasy, scoring 11.42 fantasy points per game, and he had 5 touchdowns in those 6 contests. When we go back to the last 2 seasons with Justin Jefferson in the lineup, Adam Thielen is averaging 14.51 fantasy points per game. He has scored 24 touchdowns in the last 26 games that he has played. We all know Adam Thielen is a monster, but is he going to be available for us in 2022? Again, there's going to be a little bit of a coaching change here. They bring in Kevin O'Connell. He's a former offensive coordinator of the Super Bowl winning Los Angeles Rams. And obviously, he has a past relationship with Kirk Cousins. He used to be his quarterbacks coach back in the days when Kirk Cousins was with Washington. Kirk Cousins is coming off the best 2 years of his career, in which he's put up 33 plus passing touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons, while also having a horrible relationship with his former head coach, Mike Zimmer. I mean, there was obviously a lot of animosity in that situation, and the Vikings are bringing in a coach that not only Kirk Cousins is comfortable with, but is an offensive-minded head coach that is going to unlock this offense in 2022. Let's not forget, the Los Angeles Rams last year were number 1 amongst all teams in terms of wide receiver targets. Of their 605 total passing attempts, 451, that's 75%, were sent towards wide receivers. I expect Adam Thielen to have a great year. Yet, he's being drafted later and later as the weeks have gone on. I'm fully aware of Adam Thielen's injury history. It is documented and it is relatively lengthy. But the issue is Adam Thielen's injury that he sustained last year, grade 3 ankle sprain. he forced himself back from that far too early. He's got to play it smarter. He can't be taking a 2-week break and then coming back from an ankle sprain and expecting it not to re-aggravate. And that's exactly what it did. But when Adam Thielen is on the field, he is a big playmaker, especially in this offense. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, 24 touchdowns in the last 26 games. That has allowed Adam Thielen to have 54% of his overall weeks over the course of the last 2 years be top 20 wide receiver weeks or better. I mean, that kind of contribution, yes, he's a 50-50 ball as to whether or not he's going to be a top 20 wide receiver, but as to where he's being drafted, close to DeAndre Hopkins, I'm personally willing to take the risk and say, hey, if I only get 10 games out of Adam Thielen at his current ADP, potentially coming off in the 7th round, if I can get 10 weeks out of him, 6 of them being great, 6 of them being major weeks in which he's scoring touchdowns and helping my team win, I'm willing to take that investment. But are you willing to? That's the question. He has had himself a fair share of injuries. He's getting older, but I really do think this offensive upgrade that we're going to get, in terms of the scheme, in terms of course, Adam Thielen pretty much being the Robert Woods of this offense. Justin Jefferson is going to be the Cooper Kupp, but who's going to be, that second man? Who's going to be the guy that's consistently on the field in these formations, making plays, and especially making plays in the red zone? I think it's going to be Thielen. He's the guy that I'm going after in my drafts. Moving on. Speaking of, let's talk about Robert Woods. All right, Robbie Woods, Bobby Trees. Obviously, this offseason was traded to the Tennessee Titans. And the question is, can Bobby Trees, after a season-ending ACL injury that he sustained last season, make a comeback? Obviously, the injury that he sustained was at practice. That's the worst way to go out. Non-contact injury, it just happened. And it is unfortunate, but prior to his injury, Robert Woods was a great fantasy asset last year. In half PPR, he was the number 11 fantasy wide receiver, while Cooper Kupp was the number 1 throughout the first 9 weeks of the season. He was averaging 12.74 fantasy points per game, and this really isn't something that we were surprised about. We continue to talk about how Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp were going to be great last year because of, Matthew Stafford's overall contribution. But now you're taking Robert Woods and the surgically repaired ACL, and you're moving him to Tennessee, and you no longer have AJ Brown there. Can the contributions of what Robert Woods has done in the past give us enough confidence to invest in him in 2022? I mean, in the last 3 full seasons that he played, 2018, 19, and 20, he finishes the number 10, 17, and 13 overall wide receiver while having target opportunities of 129, 139, and 130. If we're able to see Robert Woods at a full healthy spectrum and add on top of it, 110 to 120 overall targets, we could very easily see Robert Woods get back to his wide receiver 2 days. Now, the conversation, besides him coming back from his injury, is whether or not he's able to beat out the other wide receiver on this team that has built a lot of hype this offseason. Treylon Burks, of course, they traded away A.J. Brown, got themselves a first-round pick, and used it out of a wide receiver coming out of Arkansas who is 6'2", 225 pounds, and ran a 4.55 40. Treylon Burks is a great athlete, but all I've heard this offseason, all the noise, all the rumblings, is he's out of shape, and then it's all of a sudden he's working with the second and third team, and then I'm hearing Robert Woods is back, and then I go and I watch some of their practices, and I look at the clips that I see online, and it looks like Robert Woods, with no knee brace, is beginning to look like himself of old. This is a wide receiver that last season in 2021 was the number 2 ranked wide receiver in terms of run blocking, according to Pro Football Focus, in terms of their overall grades. This is a wide receiver that, in a run-first offense, will never come off the field. If Robert Woods is fully healthy and back, and Treylon Burks is going to take some time to find his footing in the National Football League and find himself some success, I think Robert Woods is a fantastic investment considering where he is being drafted. Coming off the board, currently on Underdog Fantasy, in the plus 100 range. In the double-digit rounds, I'm willing to take a risk on Robert Woods because really, I don't think it's that much of a risk. We're talking about the potential number 1 wide receiver of an offense that, yes, runs the ball first, but has found a lot of success with Ryan Tannehill under center. There's a reason why in the last 35 healthy games that A.J. Brown played, he was averaging 14.07 fantasy points per game. There's a lot of success to be had in this offense, but I wanted to do a little bit more digging. Besides A.J. Brown and the success he found, I wanted to see Is this offense capable of sustaining 2 wide receivers? If in fact Robert Woods is the number 1 and Treylon Burks eventually begins to gain rhythm and find momentum in this offense, can this offense sustain both? Well, over the course of the last 35 healthy games that A.J. Brown has played with Ryan Tannehill under center for the Tennessee Titans, the number 2 wide receiver, I mean, there's been multiple guys. There's been Adam Humphries. There's been Corey Davis. There's been Nick Ikene Westbrook. There's been a bunch of other wide receivers. But the number 2 wide receivers in those given weeks, in those 35 games, have averaged 5.53 targets per game and 9.53 fantasy points per game. Now, though those statistics aren't great, I really think you can get away with those kind of numbers depending on where a Treylon Burks or a Robert Woods is being selected. But in those specific scenarios, whenever the number 2 wide receiver of a Tennessee Titans offense has gotten 6 or more targets in a given week, they've averaged 14.27 fantasy points per week. It takes a huge jump to the next level, and that was 18 out of the last 35 games that A.J. Brown was participating in. There's a lot of potential here, and the given discount that is on Robert Woods, that is baked in to his ADP, seems to me like a bargain, especially as my wide receiver 4. Moving on to the final wide receiver, another veteran that we're going to talk about. I mean, listen, I don't even need to mention it. He is a Hall of Famer. If Julio Jones retired today, he would be in Canton a couple years from now when he's eligible. So what do we get when we take a Hall of Fame wide receiver and we add him into an offense that has the GOAT quarterback, Tom Brady? We get fantasy points, don't we? Now, I understand many of you have concerns regarding his health going into 2022. And there's a reason why Julio Jones over the last couple years hasn't really been high up on many people's draft boards, because they know that he's going into his 11th season, 12th season, in fact, and maybe another injury could sustain and end up derailing his entire year. But at his current ADP, currently being drafted 118 on Underdog Fantasy, probably later on in some other drafts, I find it very difficult to not draft Julio Jones, because I know the potential upside that we're talking about. We're talking about the impact of Tom Brady. First and foremost, Tom Brady last year set career highs in passing attempts, passing completions, and passing yards in his entire career. I mean, this man is 45 years old and he's only now setting career highs. He had his second highest passing completion percentage last year, along with his second highest passing touchdown total and third highest fantasy point per game average. Tom Brady was unstoppable last year in this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. He has found the fountain of youth down in Florida, and hopefully we're going to see that out of Julio Jones. The fountain of youth, there's a couple sips for some of these other guys. Let's not forget what Antonio Brown was able to do in 2020/2021 with this team. In those healthy games, Antonio Brown was averaging 14.49 fantasy points per game in the 13 games that he contributed in during the regular season. Anytime Antonio Brown was given 7 or more targets, he averaged 18.09 fantasy points per game. That was 9 of those 13 games. That's a 70% rate of getting 7 or more targets. Not only that, anytime AB had 5 or more receptions, he was averaging 17 fantasy points. That's 10 of those 13 games. AB was averaging insane numbers. And who's going to fill his spot? Well, Julio is. Besides the fact that AB played 79% of his overall snaps out wide, which is exactly where we like to see Julio. We're going to have a fully healthy Mike Evans on the other side of the field. We'll have Russell Gage and Chris Godwin until Chris Godwin is back at a full healthy rate. But you can't double cover all these receivers. They're going to torch you. The defenses that will be facing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this year will be in a lot of trouble. And I understand you may be worried about his overall potential to play a full season, but even if Julio doesn't play a full year and he somehow pulls an Adam Thielen, right, and only plays 10 games, the 10 games you get out of Adam Thielen and Julio will probably look relatively similar in terms of fantasy point production, but you're getting a far bigger discount on Julio as to where you have to draft him. Nearly 4 rounds later, can you invest in Julio Jones after you've already gone ahead and addressed your top 3 running backs, wide receivers, your quarterback, and your tight end? I mean, that's only 8 picks. You could even get another wide receiver on top of it if you would like, and then make your selection of Julio Jones in the later rounds. The question was posed today as to whether or not we can trust these wide receivers and whether we should be avoiding them in 2022. In my opinion, at the right price, all of these guys could have major seasons. They've done it in the past, and they certainly can continue to find production in the future. That pretty much covers today's topic. I want to thank you guys for watching the video. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to click the like button down below. Let me know down in the comment section which of these 5 wide receivers are you targeting in your 2022 fantasy football drafts. Of course, many of us will be going after DK because of his youth in comparison, but is it going to be Adam Thielen or DeAndre Hopkins? Which of those two can we trust in 2022? Can we go ahead and trust in a wide receiver coming off an ACL injury, or a wide receiver going into his 12th year with a litany of injuries? Let me know down in the comment section what you guys think. Again, be sure to subscribe. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. When you sign up today using promo code Andrew, you not only get a deposit match on your first time deposit up to $100, but you also get my draft ranking sent to you a couple days after you sign up. Thank you everybody for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.